We have the first in an ongoing lecture series, the Safe Streets Lecture Series. And our first speaker is Peter Norton. He is a historian at the University of Virginia. And he wrote a truly fantastic book called Fighting Traffic that examines the changes in the way we understand the use of our streets with the advent of the automobile. And I think as planners, as engineers, we spend a lot of time looking forward into how to create a different and better future, and we often accept the present as something that we just inherit. But the problem with that is it causes us to sometimes ignore the fact that the present was created at some time in the past, and that the ideas and the values and the beliefs that people at that time had shaped the world we inherited. We often ignore that past. And in doing so, we fail to understand how malleable and how changeable the future can be. So I find Peter's work truly fascinating because when we understand how we shaped our cities around the automobile, it gives us insight into not only the things that we gave up, but it also tells us how we might change things for the better in the future using the same tools that we applied in the past. So with that, I'm going to introduce Peter Norton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I speak at several places a year for some reason, and the first person to start that ball rolling was Eric, who had me to West Palm Beach in 2012 with a couple of his associates. And I want to recognize the fact that your time is precious, and I've tried to plan this in such a way as to make the best use of your time. I want to challenge some ideas you may already hold, maybe confirm some others and give them a better foundation than you thought they had. I understand that some of you are in or may be taking a class called Designing the City, and those who design our cities, whether they do it intentionally or not, are the people who are deciding who we meet, what jobs we get, how healthy we'll be, whether we will be able to get a job, whether we'll live in a community of social justice, whether we'll live in a community of insiders and excluded people, whether we will live in a community that's sustainable. These are the things that the people who design cities will do. So if you in fact end up contributing to the design of cities, there's no higher stakes line of work for you to be in. And maybe some of what I have to say today about how our cities are formed, in particular how our transportation is formed, will be useful to you if you pursue that further. If you don't pursue it further, you live in a designed world, and it will still be, I think, relevant to your lives, whether it's relevant to your careers or not. So I called this talk Data Don't Drive, and it has a thesis, a main claim, and I stole it. I stole it from three people who wrote a feature article in ITE Journal, Institute of Traffic Engineers Journal, in August 2014. They opened up their article, though, with their own sort of borrowing, if I can put it like that, from a predecessor in planning who said this. And if this is true, values are inescapable elements of any rational decision-making process, that challenges a phrase you will hear everywhere you go in the world of design, including urban design, computer design, product design, system design, and that is that these designs are data-driven, as if we can somehow quantify everything when people like you and me navigate the world evaluating our experience on the basis of values. Your values and my values are going to be different. The values of the person sitting to your right, to your left, are going to be different than yours, and this complicates the problem of trying to come up with some purported rational, objective, neutral design based solely on cold data, as if people don't have values. And so this statement, and I'll add a second from the same planner author, the right course of action is always a matter of choice, never merely of fact, has implications for designers. It means you have responsibilities to exercise, you have judgments to make, And while your skill at calculating and processing and interpreting data is essential and indispensable, it's also not enough, right? These two statements are from one of the most famous planners who of the 20th century, at least in the US. I'm confident that he's one of the most famous planners because I can't name very many planners, but I can name this guy. His name is Paul Davidoff. Some of you may be taking notes, that Davidoff. And his argument was exactly the opposite of this data-driven argument, as I think you can tell from these two statements that he made back in 1965 in this article, which was an inspiration for those three authors who wrote the article in the ITE journal that I mentioned, to try to remind us in our naivete that data, as essential as they are, will never deprive us of the responsibility of exercising our judgment in ways that are profoundly difficult. It was Davidoff's argument that instead of trying to have an expert come up with one data-driven solution for everybody, we should hear from everybody. Because your values are all different, I can't give you a design and know if in advance if it suits you or not. And so we need, if we together were going to design a city, we could break up into groups with different visions of this city and each have our competing designs and put them forward, kind of like the way competing lawyers do in a court of law. Only this wouldn't be two competing lawyers. This would be as many different competing ideas as there are values out there to stand for them. The sustainable city, the mobile city, right? The dense city, the green city. These would be perhaps alternatives from which you might choose. So back to ITE Journal, August 2014. Three authors were inspired by Paul Davidoff to remind the naive data followers that it's actually a little tougher than that. They opened their article like this. And I ask you to take a look at these words on the screen because they're valuable. Knowing that a 4-lane highway carries 50,000 vehicles per day, or that a particular intersection operates at level of service F, is no more a call to a specific course of action than is knowing that there's a 30% chance of rain. So don't expect data to free you from judgment. You still have to interpret. You still have to reckon not only with your own values and your own perspective on these data, right? You also have to reckon with the values and the perspectives of others, which means you're going to have to engage others. Data-driven analysis can be an excuse, right, to not actually engage with other people. Or you can engage with them in superficial ways that are simply large quantities of data without ever reckoning with the tough stories that people bring from their experiences to the worlds that they engage with. So these are descriptive statements, and as descriptive statements, their significance remains unknown. Data have no significance until we, using our judgment, interpret them, and our interpretations will vary. That makes planning hard, and it makes it a lot more interesting and a lot more important than if we could just feed people's needs into some processor through an algorithm and get a result and not need human judgment along the way, okay? So that article that I was referring to is called Decisions, Values, and Data. Data are essential, values are essential, but they both are supports to decisions. You have decisions to make. If you think they're going to be made exclusively on the basis of data, these authors, plus Paul Davidoff, plus I, urge you to go further than that, all right? This article has an authors page at the end where you can see the three authors, and you might recognize at least one of them up at the top is someone in this room right now. These are authors put together an article that has got a couple of illustrations of their point. I picked a couple of the visual ones on the grounds that they are, relatively user-friendly. We have transportation engineers who evaluate the level of service. So I just arrived at Fort Lauderdale Airport and got here within the hour. And my estimate of I-95 right now is that it's at about level of service D. So I think that sort of intuitively tells you what this is saying. It's saying if you're going slower than the speed limit, which I was most of the time and not by choice on I-95 coming from Fort Lauderdale to here just now, then that's what traffic engineers call poor level of service. Why? Because perhaps traffic congestion degrades the economy, right? What if everybody's slowing down, maybe there's less business going on? It turns out that's a guess, not a fact, and it's a guess we can look into. And one of our three authors, the one who's here, looked into it, and he found that in fact, the more traffic congestion there is, the more delay, like delay is like if it says 65 but you have to go 50, that's delay. The more delay you have, the more per capita GDP in your city you have, that is, the more income. So, one conceivable interpretation of this is maybe we should delay people more and their cities will get richer. But I think you can see how actually there may be a lot of possible explanations for this. The explanation might be that there's so much business opportunity that everybody's rushing around trying to get their piece of it. But the point is, we don't know the real significance of congestion. We don't know how much it's worth to pay to reduce traffic congestion on the roads. We follow these prescriptions, but the prescriptions are inventions. They may have validity to some degree, but they don't have any definitive final say, and above all, they don't absolve you or me or transportation engineers from the responsibility of judgment. Also in that article, no, not in that article, I found this from Federal Highway Administration. This is from the 1970s, and they're purporting to claim, on the basis of some cost data, that delay to a vehicle is of greater economic significance than delay to a pedestrian. Right? So if you have this as your guiding principle as a transportation engineer, you might make pedestrians stand at the curb waiting for their crosswalk signal to turn on for a long time. Of course, if they do that, they might get frustrated, get by a car, and then make the traffic worse, right? Or think about it this way. What causes delay? You know, when I drove here just now from Fort Lauderdale Airport to Florida Atlantic University, I wasn't delayed by a pedestrian so much as 1 second. For the most part, I couldn't find any. So the causes of the delay for me were other cars like me. So I have to ask, how much sense does it make to say that we should pour lots of public money into reducing delay for cars on the grounds that it's an economic drag on the community if it's the cars that are causing the delay? Maybe the cars should be charged for that delay that they're causing each other, right? Maybe pedestrians should be incentivized because they don't cause delay. At least they didn't in my drive here this morning. Question data, and there are no final definitive answers when you question them. This is why I recommend to you, again, Paul Davidoff's answer, which is, well, look, if you can't get definitive, final, authoritative, objective, impartial certainty from data, then let's let the people who interpret it different ways hash it out. Let's let them struggle with it. Also from the article in ITE Journal is this picture from Canberra, the capital city of Australia. And this is offering a contrary argument. So remember, level of service, A, B, C, D, E, and F, they're all saying, look, you got too many cars on the road, then you need to add a lane, and then they'll go faster, and your level of service will go up from C to B or something like that if you add a lane of traffic. Well, what these people are arguing, as I think you can tell, is what if the answer to delay is 180 degrees the opposite? Have fewer cars and put people in things like buses, where now we have 69 people taking up only this much space. Look how much the same number of people take up here, right? Would it make sense to keep adding lanes and then induce more people to say quit riding the bus or quit riding a bike and just keep adding to this? It's a question worth asking. The answer might in the end up being, yeah, it is worth it to add a lane. The trouble is, people aren't, or the experts haven't really seriously been considering that alternative. They've been following the formula like that A, B, C, D, F level of service grades. Now, I said transportation engineers are following these recipes, you might call them, like the ones in the article, like the one on level of service, and that these recipes are ostensibly neutral, data, pure approaches to these things. And that the counter-argument to the transportation engineers and the automobile advocates, therefore, is Paul Davidoff's prescription of what he calls advocacy planning. You get everybody who wants a certain vision for the future, and you get them to hash it out together. You get them to talk to each other. You get them to find compromises. You get them to find synergies. And pretty soon they're coming up with something that nobody thinks is perfect, but everybody thinks, or most people perhaps think, is better. So it would be easy to conclude at this point that it's the people who are quite happy with the automobile dependency, which I think is a fair term for it, who are happy with the status quo. And then you got the advocacy planners who are like counterculture types, you know, sitting around in cafes coming up with plans to change the world and overturn the establishment. Wrong. The leading advocate planners, that means the planners of the Paul Davidoff type, the ones who don't trust data, the ones who advance an agenda on the basis of their interests rather than on the basis of pure data, in the 20th and 21st centuries have above all been the people who want to sell you a car and make sure that you don't have any good alternatives to a car. Why? Because then you will keep driving. I could give you a lot of documentation of this. I can, for reasons of time, only give you a couple of examples. But here's one from 1927. Paul G. Hoffman worked for the Studebaker Corporation as the vice president. Some of you may recognize the name. Studebaker was a major car manufacturer in the 1920s when he wrote this article, right? And in this article, Paul Hoffman, vice president of the company, is saying, hey, we need a piece of the city planning action. Because if we don't get a piece of the city planning action, city planners, I don't know, like people in room 116 of GS, is that the word, GS? Is that the, yeah. They'll come up with things that like make it harder to drive. We need to be a piece of this puzzle. We need to be part of the action. We need to be advocates. Recognize the word? That was Paul Davidoff's word. You need to advocate for what you want from a city. There is no such thing as merely following the lead of the data. Look what he's saying here. He's saying we need to get involved. Why? Because if we don't, the continued increase of motor sales in the USA depends largely on developing more efficient, check out the word efficient. What does he mean by efficient? He doesn't mean moving the most people per unit time over unit space, right? I think you see this, right? He means moving the most cars, right? It's a very different thing. As if you had any doubt about that, that photograph from Australia, I think, pretty much clinches that, all right? So if we don't get involved in city planning, we won't be able to sell cars, right? Now, city planning is, I've looked it up in the dictionary, it doesn't say the profession where people promote selling cars. You know, it's not a car selling profession, right? But the number of cars people get and the degree to which they're dependent on them depends on the city, right? So we're right now in a place, I noticed Florida Atlantic University is extremely well supplied with parking all around the periphery of this part of campus. Yet as I drove in, I kept seeing these full signs by the parking garage. That's a sign that, you know, there's a lot of driving going on here. If you went to the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, nobody would drive, none. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, I'm just saying we got a menu, and you don't know if you picked the right thing on the menu until you've looked at all the items on the menu, right? So there are alternatives, and you can't evaluate the alternatives until you've given them a try, or taken a look at them, right? Notice that Hoffman here also says, we have had car sales tapering off recently, and this is starting to worry us in the industry. And we think the reason is traffic congestion. And there are some people saying, well, the solution is to get people in streetcars, to get them out of their automobiles, to ban curb parking. Those all ease traffic congestion. But that's not what Hoffman has in mind, as I think you can probably tell. Now, ultimately, this article ends up being based on a lot of data, right? What the average speed of a car is on a certain street, for example, how long it takes to get from point A to point B by automobile, etc. So it is, if I can't really bear the expression, but I think you could possibly say, okay, perhaps in that sense it's data-driven. But notice the selection of the data. I'm going to give you a different data-driven analysis from the same era. Oh, it's a menace to the sale of motor cars, right? This is a nice line. This paragraph, or excerpt of a paragraph, was written by a woman named Harriet Beard back in 1924. And she's saying, wait a minute, I've noticed suddenly everybody's driving. It's the 20s, you got the Model T and all that, right? Everybody's driving. And look what's happening. You know, we're missing out on the health needs, especially of children. The health needs of children are suffering, right? That's data too. These things can be measured, right? So how can you say, well, we've measured, how long it takes to drive from here to there, we've measured how much parking there is here and there, and so on, and say you have a data-driven solution if you never asked anything about health? How healthy is it, for example, to be sitting all day, whether in a room like this or in a car, with the exercise that you get being between chairs, the car seat and the classroom seat and the home seat, okay? She deliberately exaggerates and says, someday we may end up with descendants who don't even grow legs because they aren't necessary anymore, okay? She may be anticipating the movie WALL-E here to some degree, right? So it's not my message. I think Eric would agree it's been Eric Dumbaugh's message. It's been also Paul Davidoff's message. It was the message of the co-authors of the ITE article that I referred to. Data don't drive. I want you to, I think this is clear. This is sort of an abstract statement. I think it gets very clear when you make it concrete. Think of an old-fashioned sailing ship at sea, right? The data that you need to get that ship across the sea and safely into harbor come from a lot of things. I'm going to let the compass stand in for most of them, because that's a pretty good stand-in representative for most of the data that you need to get the ship safely across the ocean where you don't have any landmarks to guide you, where it might be cloudy and so your celestial navigation will be limited and so on. It's going to take a compass to get you there. So, and the compass supplies you data. Every time you look at the compass, we're going northwest by west or whatever they say, right? That's data. Now, what they're saying is increasingly is that we're getting so much data now, we are going to be steering the ship better, right? But check it out. If you had compass readings every nanosecond on your voyage, think about that, 1 billion readings a second, that's a lot of data. And it wouldn't count for diddly squat, because it doesn't tell you where you should go. It doesn't tell you what the port of call is. Somebody has to decide what the port of call is. And a compass, you can't pick up a compass and say, where should I go? It can't tell you. All it can do is tell you where you are going. What actually drives the ship? Well, I said an old-fashioned sailing ship. Well, okay, so now it's wind. Wind is moving the ship. What's the analogy of wind in the world we're around? What is, in other words, the moving force that makes social groups' agendas move? It can be money, it can be commitment, it can be values, it can be ideas, it can be whatever cause you care about. These agendas and the political power that you have or don't have, the money that you have or don't have, will actually advance your agendas. The data won't do it. The data won't do it. I think that's practically self-evident. So that's where the title of the talk comes from. You can find these kinds of data standards, and I'm talking primarily about urban transportation today, in official standards publications coming from what used to be called the American Society of Highway Engineers. That kind of, think about that title for a second. The American Society of Highway Engineers. It kind of gave away the agenda which was build highways, which meant when the critics came along and said, how do you know that a highway is the better move here? Maybe the better move would be let's say a train. Obviously, the American Society for Highway Engineers is not qualified to make that judgment. So in 1970, when they got a lot of this kind of criticism, after about 90 years, they changed their title to American Society of Highway and Transport. It's not engineers organizations. American Society of Highway and Transportation Organizations, ASHTO. They added that T, transportation, to try to dissociate themselves from this agenda of just build highways. It's rebranding, right? Company gets, maybe Facebook's going to change its name now. Might do it some good at this point. That's called rebranding. ASHO rebranded itself as ASHTO. It remains a highway building organization primarily. And it was these standards that built the car-dependent world that I traveled from Central Virginia from today. I woke up this morning in Central Virginia in a car-dependent world, and I arrived here late this morning in a car-dependent world. And it's these groups that gave it to us, in part because these groups power, remember power, like the wind in the sails? The wind in the sails for ASHO came from the groups that made it significant, groups like the American Road Builders Association. It was a big part of ASHO, among others. In fact, supplied a lot of their officers. Standards are not objective. This is United States Department of Agriculture and Nutrition advice from when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, it said, you're not healthy until you have 4 tall glasses of milk a day. Did you hear this? You have to have 4 tall glasses of milk a day. Right? So they had subsidized milk in the schools. What justified the subsidy? Oh, well, it's healthy, right? We drank it at home. There were farm milk price supports. And all of this was justified. Well, there were a couple of justifications. One of the big ones was, well, it's because milk is so important to growing bones. They kept saying this. It's total nonsense. It doesn't stand up. I think a lot of you know this. There is no nutritional need for milk in kids or adults. It can have some nutritional benefits that can be supplied from other things. There's a lot of people who can't drink milk. It turns out, and Vox did a nice piece on this, that what happened was the milk industry, the dairy industry, wanted a big market. That's how markets work. Yeah, they want to sell milk. And they figured, what if USDA said you got to have 4 tall glasses of milk a day? Ooh, that sounds nice. Now, what's the message for you? It means when you see something that stands like or represents itself as some kind of standard decided by experts and authorities who are smarter than you and who went to more graduate schools than you'll go to and who have more degrees than you could name and who have big job titles, they said it, right? This is supposed to prove it. Well, maybe as Mr. Dumbaugh said at the start of class, one of the things we can learn from the past is what it takes to question these kind of standards. It's not to say they're all wrong. It's also not to say that they're all manipulative. It is to say that they can't be definitive. We are starting to see some new standards coming out. There's an organization called National Association of City Transportation Officials that wants a different vision for the city. Remember I said competing visions? So this competing vision for the city says let's make them more people-friendly, more walkable, less car-dependent, more transit-dependent. And they're smart because they figured, well, look, it worked for the pro-car people to come up with a bunch of standards and say they're definitive. So that's what National Association of City Transportation Officials is doing with guides like this. They're saying, here are the definitive guides. There's no definitive science behind it. It is, as Paul Davidoff said, this is advocacy, planning at work in front of you, okay? So data-driven is the key word for today. And you can see that this word arose from the 1970s as it's taken off. We now have digitized our newspaper, old newspapers, so you can count the word frequencies in them. You can see the word appeared in a tiny way in the 1970s in a couple of ads for data processors. started to take off, and somewhere around here, it starts to get some serious interest. Now, this is still pretty small-time stuff. It's a small sample of major newspapers, but the word is really taking off. The word seems to have major persuasive value for those who don't know better. You know better now, all right? Take a look at these very serious presenters at world conferences on mobility or transportation. Their favorite word pair is data-driven. I found more examples of this than I had time to show you. You just keep finding data-driven. Everything's data-driven mobility. And think about it. When you say that your solutions are data-driven, a lot of people feel like, well, I don't really like your vision, but yours is data-driven. I guess we have to go with yours. The message of Paul Davidoff is, don't fall for that. That's a trick. Check this webpage out from Harbor Research about your data-driven future. Here we have these little yellow circles are supposed to indicate sensors. So these cars are automated vehicles, perhaps autonomous vehicles, and they're not going to collide because they all have sensors around them. Recent news from Arizona may lead us to question how reliable these things are. But let's assume for the sake of argument right now that they are reliable. Notice how this data-driven future somehow magically gives us the same car dependency that the advocacy planners from the automobile industry were already saying we need, and they had the honesty to say why, because that way we will sell more cars, right? Now, do you want a city where the goal of the city design is to sell cars? Take it. But if you have other priorities besides that, then maybe you should question this. I mean, this is self-evident perpetuation of car dependency right into the future, as if there aren't choices. There are, of course, choices. This is from BMW. Everything they're doing, they say, is data-driven. This somehow boosts their credibility with the naive and also makes it harder for people to question, hey, BMW, how come this amazing magic future looks so much like the present with endless highways everywhere? It's a question you might be more willing to ask if you were not bamboozled by the data-driven tagline, as so many people are. Institution of Civil Engineers is Great Britain's analog to the American Society of Civil Engineers that we have here. And even they are talking about autonomous vehicles meeting our ever-increasing demands for mobility. But notice that they equate mobility in this and other images with being in a car. Sure, that's one kind of mobility. But what about the other kinds? Why are they not getting much visibility here, right? This is mobility, according to them. It looks like car dependency. To me, I'm not telling you which one of those two things it is. Maybe it's something else. But I'm satisfied if you just ask the question, what is this really mobility, okay? So data-driven has another angle to it that's worth some attention. It turns out that if you were in an autonomous vehicle or an automated vehicle with a high degree, high approximation of autonomy, you will be, without even trying, generating enormous amounts of data. So according to Intel, once somebody is in an autonomous vehicle, you, if you're in an autonomous vehicle, will generate 4,000 gigabytes of data a day, right? That's a lot of data, especially when you compare it to how much you're generating right this moment on a per day basis. You're generating, without being in an autonomous car, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 gig a day just by using your phone and your laptop and that kind of thing. All right? So you'll be generating 3,000 times more data if you're in an autonomous vehicle. Why is Intel, like, is this image expresses some degree of excitement about this? Why are they excited? Why is Intel boasting that thanks to their AV technology, you know, they're the world's major chip manufacturer, thanks to AV technology, when you are in an autonomous vehicle, you'll be generating 3,000 times more data per day? Why do they care? So what? You have any guesses? Yes, sir.
You can sell data.
There you go. Yeah, if you had any doubts about that, just check out the recent news about Facebook, okay? Data is money. Not directly, but you can translate it into money because it helps you. Like, for example, if you send out an ad to the world and you don't target it, you're going to be missing, you're going to be hitting people 99.9% of whom, let's say, don't care about your ad. But with data, you can target the ad to that tiny group that's actually going to respond to it. Save you an enormous amount of money, right? But check it out. If your automobile is to you a way to get around, but to the people who make it is a way to extract data from you and then use it to sell stuff, generating value from you that they are not compensating you for, is that a world you want? More than that, another question to ask. Are they, I heard reference to a class title that I believe was Designing the City, right? What kind of city are you going to want if you can get 3,000 times more value out of people when they're in a car than when they're, let's say, on foot? Well, if you like money, you're going to say, I want people in vehicles all the time. Now, that's a really interesting position to take when, for example, we have a public health emergency attributable to sedentary living and inactivity. It's really interesting, you know, cardiovascular disease, for example. Diabetes is associated with inactivity as well. We have also a sustainability disaster to at least discuss. Do we want people requiring heavy fuel-driven vehicles, whether that fuel is generated by an electric power generating plant or by fossil fuels or by biofuels? Do we want that as our mobility future, as the primary way of getting around, right? As the world's population increases, do we want to continue to clear land to create more parking lots, more highways? Is that really the future we want? Maybe it is, but you can't know until you know the alternatives. I want to give you a closer look at this. This is from a press release, an announcement, public announcement by Intel's CEO, a guy named Brian Krzanich, if KRZ is pronounced Krzanich. Brian Krzanich says, not to the car occupant, not to the people who will be riding around in the cars. This message is for the people they want to partner with to become the big AV, automated vehicle manufacturers of the future. And what they're saying is, we're the best company to team up with because we can harvest this data from you, not from just anybody, from you specifically. Once you're in an autonomous vehicle, you're generating data for them. Data that's got dollars and cents value to them that they have no intention to pay you for, okay? Moreover, data that will affect your life. Moreover, data that will incentivize them to design a world where you continue to have to be in a car as much as ever, even when it's possible to design an autonomous vehicle future where you could be in a car a lot less. Perhaps that would be healthier. Perhaps you would find that more pleasant. Perhaps you'd enjoy the choices. Perhaps you'd enjoy driving more if it was one alternative that you chose because you wanted it, rather than the only way to get around. Now, I used the word harvest. Brian Krzanich has, I think, a creepier metaphor. He calls, I'm quoting, data is the new oil. Data is the new oil in the future of automated driving. And check it out. Who's the oil well? You. So wait a minute, you must be thinking this guy's crazy. He's pissing off the people who he needs to ride in these cars to have a future for automated vehicles. Well, this message, he knows that you don't go look up press releases. I mean, he didn't know that I would find it and show it to you, right? So you're welcome. But most people don't go and look up the press releases of a tech company. He knows that the people who look up the press releases of a tech company are the big time people who want to have a partnership with BMW and Intel, or they want to start a project of some kind. They want to attract investments. Those are the kind of people who see this, and those people are totally cool about calling you the oil well that they're going to pump data oil out of while they redesign the world around getting more data out of you. If that sounds great to you, don't worry about it. But if you're troubled by it, I suggest you remember Paul Davidoff's advice. Data is the new oil, says Intel's CEO. He gets a little more specific. Check this line out from his press release. Data is literally the new oil. I'm quoting, right? Some of you will recognize, perhaps from an English class, that if it's literally the new oil, then this data might actually be a dark brown fluid. Yeah, that's what literally means. So I'm kind of wondering how this could get out of the CEO of the world's top tech company, or the world's top chip hardware company. Every autonomous car will generate the data equivalent of almost 3,000 people. He's saying this with excitement, right? This means that you right now to Intel are worth 1/3,000th of what a person in an AV is worth. And that means not that they don't like you, it means they want you in an AV, an autonomous vehicle. You see this? This is why he's saying this. He's saying, you guys, I'm talking to you, I can get you involved in this, you can be part of this, because we're going to increase the value of the average person by 3,000, and we're going to be the ones who get the benefit, not those people, right? Now, he'll try to say, well, those data will make your life better too. Yeah? Well, if the data are really that valuable, he'd pay you for them. Data that tracks how many people are in the car, music preferences of you want, some of you will be happy with Intel knowing this. Of course, a lot of people already know what you listen to. But not because of your driving, because you're driving in a conventional car. Or even what stores or brands passengers prefer, and when you're near them, tease up sales items. Many of you will be parents at some point. I don't know if you want your kids sitting in the back of your car suddenly begging you for something to buy because they've been, quote, teed up an ad for it, right? Wearables and other sensors inside the car can also monitor behavior, focus, emotional biometric status to increase safety and security. Yeah, to increase safety and security and value for the data collectors. So I don't want to say that this is wrong. I just want to say that this is not data-driven mobility, which is what they say it is, right? This is what David Buckingham, who's a data collector, calls it. He said, data is the new oil is really the in phrase among data collectors. You should know this because you're the oil wells. Why we believe that they're sort of wearing it out already. It's the new metaphor and they can't stop using it. This is sort of like when you're in the business world, these are your memes, okay? I want to give you a question. Is this really data-driven mobility that we're talking about, or that Brian Krzanich is talking about? He calls this data-driven mobility. Other people call the same business model whereby what you think of as driving, they think of as data collection. Other people are calling that data-driven mobility too. But mobility, they don't care about mobility. Mobility is just the tool. Mobility is the means to an end. It's not the end. It's not what they are after. They're not interested in mobility, right? I would suggest that we call this data-driven data collection. In other words, they're using data to figure out where they need to get more data from. It's also technology-driven data collection because they're developing new technology to get data from you, right? This may have been, the significance of this may have been harder to explain a few years ago. But I think it should be clear, as of March the 22nd, 2018, that the implications of this data collection, just because you want to, let's say, go to the store and you're inadvertently having all your data collected, are not only that you're giving somebody else value for something they're not paying you for, which some people would call theft. Also, it means, though, that they're redesigning a world around ways that will maximize data collection rather than maximize mobility. And also, as we now know, it has major political implications because those data tell something about, who you might want to target because you're aware this person has a certain bias, and if you feed that bias in such a way, you can have a certain desired political effect. Something to be thinking about, particularly among people who are interested in designing cities. So here's an old cartoon. This is 1971. It's from a book called Autokind versus Mankind. And this is a critique of data collection too. Now the phrase data-driven was not around when this cartoon was drawn, but it is criticizing the same thing. So you go to the director of planning, and many of you are studying planning or perhaps thinking about being planners. You go to the director of planning, and it turns out the director of planning is a car, says the cartoon, right? What does this mean? Well, you know, you've got a planner who's smart, uses a lot of data, collects a lot of data, interprets those data, applies those data, but all to advance one agenda, right? So you remember Paul Davidoff, advocacy planning. This is all advocacy for one party, that is the people who want to sell cars, right? So this director of planning, he or she could, I think, with some credibility say everything we do is data-driven. It's just that we pick the data, right? And we pick the destination. It's like, sure, I read the compass. But you still get to ask, yeah, okay, you read the compass, but where are you taking us? Where's the port of call? That's a fair question. This is based on data. Of course, this stands for data. Perhaps this is increasing auto sales, and that's probably what it does mean, because a lot of the transportation engineering that we inherited from the 20th century and still have was promoted as a way to sell cars. That's not speculation, that's documented fact. The people who wanted to sell cars said, let's get to work and make sure that the engineers design in such a way as to help us sell cars. This director of planning could also say that we drive the data. So, right, supposedly designs are data-driven, but designs also drive data. Think about that. It works both ways. So here is Edward S. Jordan, an automobile manufacturer in the 1920s, saying, we don't have enough highways, right? And what's the problem with not having enough highways? Oh, does it mean it takes longer to get to work? Well, yeah, but the real issue with it is it's hindering motor car sales. So we're going to have to get transportation engineers to agree that the basis of adding a lane is when you've slowed down the cars enough that people stop driving in the cars, right? In the final analysis, you cannot restrict the use of the automobile. He's trying to forbid this. He's saying, no, don't restrict automobiles. That's off the table. It's not on the menu. You don't get to pick it. You must provide floor space for their operation. He's setting down the parameters. Now, how is this supposed to affect transportation engineers? Why should they care? Well, basically, nobody knows this. Eric Dunbaugh knows it, I know it, and in a second, all of you will know it. And you'll probably be the only ones in a 100-mile radius who know it, besides Eric and me. But the first transportation engineering consultancy in the USA was established by the automobile industry. And they trained the first generation of transportation engineers. And surprise, surprise, they were totally paid for by the auto industry, every dime of their education. And surprise, surprise, they said, well, as engineers, our job is to move cars, even in cities, right? That's a corroborating example. For reasons of time, I'll just skip that corroborating example. It has a couple of nice lines in it, okay? This is from Ford Times, Ford as in Ford Motor Company, 1950. They're saying in their public relations, a good road generates traffic. By relieving congestion and making travel more pleasant, it induces people to use their cars who would otherwise leave them in the garage. Hooray, right? They're saying this is a good thing. The same thing happens whenever a good road replaces a bad one. And they're saying, yeah, okay, what's going to happen is you're going to have more distance, but you're going to overcome that because the transportation planners are going to give you more highways and more lanes to drive on. Which is really interesting, because do you remember the level of service diagram? It says like when you're getting delayed in traffic, that's a bad thing and we need to supply more roads because delaying drivers, costing you more time, is bad thing. But here they are at the same time saying, if you want to translate that into driving a greater distance, that's fine with us. Which is contradictory, because if you drive a greater distance to work because the engineers are spending public money reducing the delay, right, then in effect the thing they were saying is this evil that has to be fought They're at the same time causing it by causing you to move further away. The people who wanted to sell cars, in this case this is the National Automobile Dealers Association, were relentless in their message. The automobile is a necessity. This is from the cover of the National Automobile Dealers Association journal. They put this on the cover because the US government, during the Korean War, when industries were taxed to the maximum to produce materiel for the war, there was a government proposal, maybe we should, put automobiles at a lower priority. National automobile dealers fought back with something they called the Essentiality Campaign. The automobile is essential and therefore you can't restrict it. What this is saying is the perception of driving as a necessity is not a perception that emerged from the soil as a natural perspective of the great people of the country. No, it's a message that was sold like shampoo is sold, right? If you have time, I decided to make fun of this particular one because they're all looking essentially at gridlock and they're supposed to be inspired by it. You might, if you miss a couple of those, it's no great loss, right? What we're really after is self-driving data, right? Self-driving data is an analogy with the self-driving car, right? What would self-driving data be, right? It would be data that justifies an action. You getting this? Data that justifies an action that will in turn generate more data that will justify that action further, right? In a self-perpetuating positive feedback loop. Well, consider the power that would have if that drove an agenda that suited you. Well, let's say you were in the auto industry and you could come up with such a positive feedback loop, or self-driving data, I think is a fair way to call it, that happened to promote car dependency and car ownership. What is self-driving data? Federal Highway Administration statistics show that Americans prefer their automobiles to all other forms of transportation. Only in rare cases do alternative modes of transportation carry more than a small percentage of all trips. Now this is from a Federal Highway Administration report with a lot of dense math. It's very, obviously the authors were very smart, but is there, do you see how stupid this statement is? Right? Like, what if they locked you in a 7-Eleven and then after a week looked at your diet and the only thing you'd had was processed food? Would they get to say, well, obviously you prefer processed food? If you put a person in a car-dependent environment and then they don't drive, and then they don't walk or take the bus, that should not be a surprise. And it tells you absolutely nothing about preferences, and yet they had the temerity to use the word prefer, right? So notice that this line is justifying something, right? It's justifying an effort to continue to serve, above all, cars, because that way you will serve the most people. But why are cars number one? This is a script from a radio show. Radio used to be the mass media of the mid-20th century. The text was all written up in advance by the National Automobile Dealers Association. And then a guy from the Automobile Dealers Association would go on the local radio station, and this would be happening all over the whole country, pretending to have an ordinary conversation with the local disc jockey. And the local disc jockey will ask you scripted questions, thank you and good morning, good evening, everyone. And then this person would pretend to be, I'm just giving you my opinion, and he would then recite how, in fact, we need to have relief of traffic congestion because we have inadequate parking and insufficient and deficient highways. And so now you have local people at local radio stations that people trust all over the whole country, all saying the same thing, all neighbors of yours in effect because they're from the same town, and people are thinking, oh yeah, maybe we need more highways. Maybe some others are like, no, we don't. But you can see how the effect of this could, and you should be asking yourself, why are automobile people doing this? I thought everybody wanted a car anyway. If everybody wants a car anyway, then you don't have to convince people that everyone wants a car. Oh, well, maybe not everybody really always prefers the car. This is again from, I'm going to skip that one too for reasons of time. This is 1938 here. This is a city planner, a very famous one named and when I say a city planner is famous, it is because I don't know very many. Harland Bartholomew this time. He did the city plan for Lansing, Michigan, that's the state capital, and said some amazing things in this. He said, by 1965, he's talking about 30 years later, there will be about 50,000 autos here. It's very interesting because he's treating this as a fixed quantity. You know, it's not something we can influence, right? So it's a given. There are going to be 50,000 cars, and therefore it will be necessary to develop many wide and direct routes. You see the weird reasoning here? It's like, well, wait a minute. Maybe we don't have to have 50,000 cars if we put our money into something besides wide and direct routes. Or maybe if the only thing we do is build wide and direct routes, we'll have 100,000 cars, and the problem will be solved. Right? Do you see how these smart people aren't making sense? And when smart people aren't making sense, it's usually because they're playing along with some agenda that suits their convenience. I'm suggesting to you that you can watch for those things, be skeptical of them, and propose alternatives. Weirdly, Harland Bartholomew calls the result, which is car dependency, quote, a balanced urban development with no traffic congestion or delay that would result from building lots of highways. You know, I'll just refer to your own personal experience of highways in Florida to perhaps have you question the validity of that statement. So data don't drive. We should be asking what does drive. I'm going to offer you a little analogy because you do need to know what does drive if data doesn't drive. And this is an analogy with physics. You remember Newton's three laws, right? Something in motion will stay in motion until another force acts on it. Force equals mass times acceleration, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? There's more laws of physics. Those are the three laws of motion. They come up in this thing. I'm going to offer you, I'll call them patterns, because in social life we don't have laws, it's too messy, but we can talk about patterns. And I'm going to base these patterns on physics. Energy has two forms, kinetic energy and potential energy, right? An object on a trajectory has a momentum, and for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. All right, I want to start with energy has two forms, kinetic energy and potential energy. And if this sounds abstract, I'm going to try to make it very concrete now. This is a photograph of a man, a pedestrian, in a marked crosswalk. This is 1973. He's in a marked crosswalk with the signal in his favor, and he's getting hit by a car. And as you probably guessed, it's staged. Don't worry, this guy's not actually getting hurt. He's some kind of setup here. He's getting hit by a car, right? Well, I mean, this is F equals ma, right? Force equals mass times acceleration, which gives the advantage to the car. Of course, we're talking about social life. Social life includes the law. The law gives the pedestrian the right of way here. But there's somebody who wouldn't necessarily want everybody to exercise their legal right to cross the street in the marked crosswalk with the signal in their favor, right? And in particular, they don't want such a person, if they're hit, to be able to say, I was walking with the signal in the crosswalk, and therefore you're liable and you have to pay for my hospital bill, right? And that's why, apparently, this is actually from an advertisement with the title, Another American is About to Die for His Rights. The message of this ad is, if you're a pedestrian, not only do you give up access to all of the street except the crosswalk, we want you to actually give up access to the crosswalk too until you're really sure that nobody's going to run you down. So this is from Mobil Oil Corporation. Mobil Oil Corporation, of course, sells real oil, not data oil. And that's, of course, closely correlated to car sales. And in this ad, they're suggesting to you that even if you have the right of way and the green light, don't rush out belligerently to get what's coming to you, because you might. Kind of creepy, kind of creepy. Well, this is agenda advancement. You could call this force equals mass times acceleration. In this case, the mass is not only the automobile, right, but the attempt to develop a city that favors the automobile, and an attempt here to develop social norms, that is, notions about what we should and shouldn't do, that favor the driver over the pedestrian. Mobil Oil we want you to live. That's the only corporate tagline that ever has made a little chill go down my. We want you to live. Thanks, Mobil. Right? So energy has two forms, kinetic and potential. What you're seeing here is kinetic. But what you normally see, and you've seen it, you probably saw it today, and maybe you practiced it today. You walk up to a street, maybe you have the crosswalk, maybe you have the right-of-way, but you, not out of some like high-minded conscientiousness, but just out of self-preservation, you might wait anyway. What's happening there, I think you can analogize to potential energy. In other words, no one's getting hurt, but that doesn't mean there isn't any violence, force, power, right? Do you see how that is? I think that might get clear if I illustrate it with a different historical analogy. This is Montgomery, Alabama, May 1963, May the 3rd, 1963. And civil rights marchers are marching in the streets, and Bull Connor's Montgomery police force is attacking with German Shepherd dogs, right? This is very clearly and obviously kinetic energy. This is violence, this is force, this is intimidation, because the people who wanted to keep segregation resorted to a naked display of force in order to keep it. And this kind of display has an effect, right? Now Martin Luther King, who was the leader of the Montgomery movement, and that's where that photograph was taken, was arrested during it for holding a march without a permit. Do you know who the permit givers? They were, of course, the segregationists in the police force that were intent on preventing civil rights in Montgomery. Well, Martin Luther King was arrested. He went to jail April 1963, and he got a lot of criticism from well-meaning people who were like, I want what you want, but you should get a permit. And he wrote back, and they said not only should you get a permit, they also would say, hey, you're causing violence, you're provoking people, right? You're provoking people to violence. He had a very interesting answer that every literate person should read carefully. Some of you have, I'm sure. It's his letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote on the only paper available to him. Read it sometime. It's full of wisdom. Specifically of interest to this right now is, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. It was the tension he was getting criticized for. The tension is already there, but you remember potential energy? You can't see potential energy. There's potential energy that'll make those glasses make a sound when they hit the floor if I brush them off, which I won't because I don't have another pair. And that is energy too. That is energy too, and this is what he's saying. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out into the open where it can be seen and dealt with. In other words, it's actually constructive to, quote unquote, provoke this attack, because now at least people can finally see the violence. It's no longer just potential violence, it's actual violence. And it works. Do you remember that photograph of a man being attacked by a police dog? It got on the next day's front page paper. It worked exactly the way Martin Luther King said it should work. It drew attention, visible attention, the attention of millions of people across the whole country and to some degree around the world to this injustice, which now President Kennedy went on television shortly afterwards, not because he wanted to. He depended on white Democrat segregationist voters, and he really didn't want to go on TV and lose any of them. But what happened was he was forced to take a stand against the intimidation of the civil rights workers, which is exactly what King was seeking to do. You can see this in traffic too. Have any of you heard of critical mass? Raise your hand if you've heard of critical mass as it applies to bicyclists. Just a couple of you, maybe three. Critical mass is, in effect, applying that technique of exposing the usual potential energy of the street. So if you're cycling in a street, first of all, you may not bike at all, not because you don't want to, but because the traffic bothers you. That's a major reason for me stopping to think, do I really want to bike at all? You may not bike at all. If you do bike, you're going to be constantly feeling like the most vulnerable, the least powerful. You're going to be constantly conceding even your legal rights to others because your life is at stake and theirs isn't. Critical mass says, let's flip that around. Let's send out 200, 500, 1,000 bicyclists at the same time, and now we will be the dominant power in the streets. And if people object and say, hey, you're getting in the way of traffic, we have an answer. We are traffic. We're better traffic. We're more spatially efficient traffic. We're more health-giving traffic. We're more sustainable traffic. We're more, the advantages go on and on and on. So that was potential energy and kinetic energy. Let's say a word about trajectories. This man, also somebody everybody should know, you may not recognize him, some of you heard of him, Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson, like Martin Luther King, like critical mass, wanted social change. To get social change, that means they want a different future. But unlike others who said to get a different future, we need to think about the future, he said, you will never get the future you want until you fix the past you inherited. Remember Professor Dumbaugh's statement about the past we inherited? That past you inherited is not just some random facts about the past. Those who had an agenda to justify wrote histories to justify that agenda. Did you hear that? Those who have an agenda, they write the histories that will justify that agenda. Segregationists wrote the history of the post-Civil War South in such a way as to justify segregation and disenfranchisement. And Carter Woodson said, we will never get a future of social justice, of racial justice, and of voting rights until we fix that. Specifically, we have to repair the damage of the people he called the rewriters of history. So he was a history teacher like me, and I follow his example, and the example is go back and find the original documents, the original sources, stop reading the histories that were written by the people with agendas to advance, and start piecing together histories yourself. Start, in short, being your own historian. Was that a question? No, misinterpreted that. So, in physics you know what a trajectory is. History has a trajectory too. Like in physics, a trajectory is defined by time. We have a future. That future is on a trajectory with the status quo. The reason why it is this future and not some other is because it's on this trajectory. But check it out. This trajectory, because of the fact that people with agendas to advance are the people who write histories, is fungible. As we can shift it, we can move it, we can adjust it, we can deflect it. How do you deflect it? Well, if you want future 2 instead of future 1, you're going to need to come up with past 2. So shifting this red arrow means it's hard to shift. To make it easier to shift, you need a different past, right? And now it gets easy, right? So if you want a different future, you've got to go back and figure out if the past you inherited is one of the obstacles. Because probably if you want a different future, you're not happy with the status quo. And if you're not happy with the status quo, but the status quo is justified by the respectable people, that means there's a history that justifies it. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. A lot of you maybe hadn't heard of it until August. On August 12th, 2017, we had a visit, shall I say, by alt-right white supremacists. One of them, a guy named James Field from Ohio, and we're talking about mobility, traffic, cars here, used his car as an instrument of death. And this guy killed our neighbor, Heather Heyer, by running his car over her, knowing he was engaging in a very dangerous action. This same kind of action, it wasn't racially motivated, but the same action occurred in 1910 in Chicago. Why am I putting these two people side by side? The guy on the right is named Lawrence Lindblom, if you're interested. Is both of these guys were charged with murder for killing a person who was in the street. The last guy to get a murder rap for doing this was Lawrence Lindblom, until James Field was charged with murder in 2017 following this attack. Why is that significant? Think about what this means. It means that there was a time when we thought if you operated a car in a street where people are and you killed somebody, that you had done something really terrible. That you, as the operator of a deadly machine, presumably have a responsibility to use it in such a way that you don't kill people. When you fail, as Lawrence Lindblom did and as James Field did, you should, your action is in effect making the car a murder weapon, and you should be tried accordingly. So the Washington Post, December, reported that we have a murder charge for James Field. That caught my notice because we don't charge people who kill others with their car with murder anymore. Maybe something's changing. Yes, the James Field case was extreme, but he didn't single out, and there was not a premeditated plan here. That was also Lawrence Lindblom's charge back in 1910. They're both charged with murder. What happened in between? Right? There's the Chicago Examiner headline, Lawrence Lindblom. There's this, I'll skip the scene of the crime. That's the actual spot of the murder. Here's some headlines about what they are calling murder with an automobile. I want you to compare this death site when it happened with the death site today. No pedestrians get killed there anymore because there aren't any. If one did get killed there, this is the same spot. If one did get killed there, everybody would blame the pedestrian. That's significant. We've redefined what streets are for, right? So we have to shift from past one, and I'm moving a little more quickly here because I'm a little behind schedule, but this is car sellers' version of history justifies car sellers' future. Remember trajectories? This is the history of the automobile we inherited in this country is a history that justifies car dependency. This model of the city of the future was built by car makers, General Motors, to sell a future of car dependency. It was justified by a history that said everybody prefers driving. That's another version of it as well. Disney had something called Magic Highways USA in 1958 as well. And as you can see, this vision of the future is totally car dependent. Has autonomous vehicles. In 1961, the auto industry put on a history of the automobile on television that said, we have a love affair with cars. We want cars. It was another past that justified another car-dependent vision of the future. This is a vision of the future, and as you can see, the car dependency is quite extreme. So these trajectories serve the interests of those who present them. This is from Firestone. They sell tires. I'll skip that example too. This is from Portland Cement Association. They sell highways. So of course they say they cure congestion. What we actually get from these things, there's the promised vision. This is more what they actually look like on the right. This is what happens when you apply this to a real city. That is Hastings Street in Detroit. And if you're not looking at the screen, look at it now, because I'm going to show you the same spot 2 years later. You got this? This is the African-American neighborhood of Detroit called Paradise Valley in 1959, before the automobile-centered urban designers got a hold of it. This is the same view in 1961. All right, this is what they did to people's homes, all in the name of this car-dependent vision. There they are side by side. This is what happens to central Detroit when everybody goes on those highways. It all gets turned into parking garages and surface parking lots. I would argue that's not a city, that's a car storage facility. This is all justified too in the National Museum of American History in Washington, and in these car-dependent visions of the future, which the car dependency remains a constant. And I'll wrap it up there by showing you some alternatives. This is the actual past. Notice how the actual past, there are bikes, there's people riding. And there's outrage when people get killed by cars for using streets what they always had been for. I think 3:15 was my end time, so I'm rushing up to the end. I kind of overpacked this presentation, obviously. This is Miami. We have a pedestrians' rebellion that nobody remembers. A mass revolt by pedestrians against motor traffic in 1955. Everybody just said, screw it, I'm walking where I want to. I'm not paying attention anymore because the streets are for people. And we can shift history's trajectory. That's showing a shift of history. We can have a streets are for people future or a streets are for cars future. I've told you how history's trajectory is shifted. Now you know. You guys can go out and shift it. Paul Davidoff gets the last word. This is from his article. As a profession charged with making urban life more beautiful, exciting, and creative, and more just, we have had little to say. Our task is to train a future generation of planners to go well beyond us in its ability to prescribe the future urban life. Thank you for your patience over the last 75 minutes. Thank you all very much. I know if probably class is over, or if it is a class.
That is, and it's also not. So summer class, summer. So if you're done with class and you want to hand in your assignment, now's the time. Grandma?